I am lying in this bed with my eyes closed and my breathing slow. And my daughter-in-law thinks I cannot hear a single word she is saying. She is standing right there, 3 feet from me, talking to the hospice nurse in a voice she thinks is a whisper. But I have been a mother for 51 years. And mothers learn to hear whispers the way other people hear shouting. She says, "Don't call me when she dies. Just call Stephen." I don't need to be there for that part. The nurse goes quiet. I feel her hesitate beside my bed. And I lie there, perfectly still. My chest rising and falling the way it has for the last 6 days. And I let that sentence sink into me like a stone dropping into still water. Before I tell you what happens next, before I tell you how this story unfolds, I want to know who is sitting with me right now. Type your name below and tell me which city you are watching from tonight. I read every single one of them. And it means more to me than you know to have company while I tell this. And if you have a grandmother, if you love her, if she ever held your hand when you were small and scared, hit that like button for her right now. Subscribe if you are new here. And share this with someone who still calls their grandma just to hear her voice. Now let me tell you what happened in this house. Because it is happening right now. This very week and I am not finished yet. My name is Betty Carter. I am 79 years old. And 3 months ago the doctor sat across from me in his office with his hands folded on his desk and told me the cancer had spread to places they could no longer fight. He used the word months and not the word years. He used the word comfortable and not the word cure. I remember nodding because I did not want him to see my hands shake. I drove myself home that day, parked in my own driveway. The driveway of the house my late husband Harold and I bought in 1974. And I sat in the car for 20 minutes before I could make myself walk inside. My son Stephen moved me into his guest room 2 weeks after that appointment. He said it made more sense. That hospice care would be easier to coordinate if I was under his roof. That his wife Amanda had already looked into everything and set up a whole plan. I remember how proud he sounded telling me this. Like Amanda handling my dying was some kind of gift she was giving me. I said yes, because I did not have the strength to say no. And because some small foolish part of me believed my daughter-in-law actually wanted to take care of me. I have been in this house 9 weeks now. The room they gave me used to be Stephen's home office before the children came along. And there is still a faded rectangle on the wall where a bookshelf used to sit. There is a hospital bed now, rented, with rails on the sides like I am a child who might roll out in the night. There is a window that looks out over the backyard, where my grandchildren, Mason and Ava, used to run through the sprinkler. The sprinkler every summer, when they were small enough to still want to hug me at the door. Mason is 14 now. Ava is 11. They still hug me at the door, actually. Though Mason does it fast now. Like a boy embarrassed by his own softness. Ava climbs right up onto the bed beside me and tells me about her day in more detail than I could ever want. And I never once tell her to stop talking. Because every word out of her mouth is a gift. I did not expect to still be receiving at this point in my life. The nurse who comes 3 times a week is named Rebecca Scott. She is younger than my own daughter would have been. If I'd had a daughter, somewhere in her early 30s I would guess. With steady hands and a voice that never once talks down to me the way some people talk to the dying. Like death makes you deaf and stupid at the same time. Rebecca checks my vitals, adjusts my medication, asks me real questions and waits for real answers. In the 9 weeks she has been coming to this house, she has become the only person besides my grandchildren who speaks to me like I am still a whole person and not a countdown clock mounted on the wall of somebody else's guest room. Which brings me back to today. To the sentence that is still sitting in my chest like a swallowed stone. It was Tuesday afternoon, and Rebecca had just finished checking my blood pressure. I had my eyes closed because the medication makes me tired in waves. And I had drifted somewhere close to sleep, but not quite there. The way you do when your body is worn thin but your mind refuses to fully let go. I heard the door open. I heard Amanda's voice. The particular tone she uses when she thinks no one important is listening. Light and careless. Like she is discussing what to order for dinner instead of discussing my death. How much longer do you think? Amanda asked. And I heard the clipboard in Rebecca's hands go still. It's hard to say exactly, Rebecca answered. Careful, professional. Could be a few weeks. Could be less. Every patient is different. And then Amanda said it. Don't call me when she dies. Just call Stephen. I don't need to be there for that part. I want you to understand something important about who I am. Before I go any further with the rest of this story, I have never been the kind of woman who cries easily, not once in all my many years. Harold used to say. I had a spine made of the same steel as the bridge we drove over on our honeymoon. And for 51 years I never once gave him a reason to doubt it. I did not cry when my mother passed. I did not cry when Harold himself passed 11 years ago. Not until I was alone in the house that night and could finally let myself feel the size of the silence. But lying there in that bed, hearing my son's wife plan her absence from my death like she was declining an invitation to a dinner party. Something in my chest cracked open that I did not know was still capable of cracking. I did not open my eyes. I did not gasp or stir or give either of them any sign that I had heard a single word. I simply lay there, my heart pounding, under skin so thin now you can nearly see the blood moving beneath it. And I listened as Amanda's footsteps retreated down the hallway, light and unbothered. The footsteps of a woman who believes she has just said something perfectly reasonable to a nurse and nothing more. Rebecca stayed a moment longer. I felt her hand rest gently on my arm, just for a second. And I understood in that touch that she knew I was not fully asleep. She did not say anything. She simply finished writing her notes, packed her bag quietly, and let herself out. And I lay there in the wreckage of what I had just heard, thinking about the woman my son married 9 years ago and wondering how I had never truly seen her until this exact moment. I want to tell you something about Amanda Davis, because that is who she was before she became Amanda Carter, before she took my son's name and my son's heart and, eventually it seems, my son's house. When Stephen first brought her home, I remember thinking she was lovely in the way certain flowers are lovely. Bright and photogenic and entirely without scent. She complimented my cooking in a way that felt rehearsed. She asked about my late husband with a sympathy that never quite reached her eyes. I told myself I was being an unfair old woman, the kind of mother who can never approve of any girl her son loves, and I pushed my doubts down where I keep everything I have ever decided not to say out loud. I remember the very first dinner she came to, sitting at my table in a dress that was slightly too formal for a Tuesday night meal of pot roast and green beans, complimenting the tablecloth, complimenting the silverware, complimenting everything except the actual food in front of her, which she moved around her plate more than she ate. Stephen watched her the entire evening the way young men watch women they have already decided to marry, with a kind of soft blindness that makes it impossible for them to see anything you might try to point out. I did try, gently, once, a few months into their courtship. I asked him, over coffee one Saturday morning, whether he ever noticed that Amanda seemed to measure people before she decided how warm to be toward them. He laughed it off. He said I was being protective. And maybe I was, but a mother's instincts are rarely as foolish as the people around her want to believe. And mine, as it turned out, had been right from the very beginning. I watched the wedding happen 2 years later in a banquet hall. Amanda had chosen without asking my opinion on a single detail. From the flowers down to the seating chart, which placed me at a table near the kitchen doors alongside distant cousins I barely recognized, while Amanda's own mother sat at the head table beside the newlyweds. I told myself that was simply how modern weddings worked now, that I should not read insult into every small exclusion, and I smiled through the toasts, and others on Dansvis, Stephen, and told myself the years ahead would soften whatever rough edges I thought I was seeing in his new wife. They did not soften. If anything, they sharpened, slowly, so gradually that I could never quite point to a single moment and say, "There, that is when it changed. That is when my son's wife decided I mattered less than the furniture in her living room." It was the accumulation of 100 small choices, each one small enough on its own to explain away, but together forming a shape I eventually could not ignore, no matter how much I wanted to. 9 years is a long time to keep pushing doubts down. Long enough that they build up into something solid, something with weight, something that does not simply disappear because you have decided to be polite about it. Over those 9 years, I watched Amanda slowly rearrange my son's life around her own comfort, one small decision at a time. The way water rearranges stone without you ever seeing the exact moment the shape changes. She convinced him to stop visiting me on Sundays, the tradition Harold and I had kept alive with Stephen since he was a boy, because Sundays were family time now, meaning her family, meaning the version of family that did not include his mother. She convinced him that my opinions on Rasing Mason and Ava were outdated and unwelcome, so slowly that I stopped offering them at all, until I became a woman who nodded and smiled and kept her thoughts to herself at every holiday dinner, a stranger wearing my own face at my own son's table. I remember the Christmas, 4 years ago now, when I offered to host the whole family at my house the way Harold and I always had, the way I had done every single year since Stephen was a boy. Amanda suggested, gently at first, and then more firmly when I did not immediately agree, that it might be easier on everyone if the holiday moved to their house instead, citing the children's school schedules and the difficulty of travel and a dozen other reasons that all sounded reasonable individually and suspicious collectively. I gave in, because I always gave in, because giving in had become the price of remaining included in my own son's life. That was the last Christmas I hosted in my own home. Every year since, I have been a guest in a house that used to feel like an extension of my own family, sitting in a chair by the window while Amanda directed the day like a stage production. She alone had written. I remember the birthday parties for Mason and Ava that I found out about after the fact, invitations that seemed to arrive to me a day or two later than everyone else, or sometimes not at all, with Amanda apologizing afterward for some mix-up with the mail or the guest list that always seemed, strangely, to only ever affect me. I remember the family photographs on the mantel that slowly, year after year, stopped including me at all, replaced instead with pictures of Amanda's side of the family, her parents, her sister, her nieces and nephews, until the only trace of my existence in that living room was a single, small frame tucked on a shelf in the hallway, easy to walk past without ever really seeing. I want to be fair, because fairness matters to me even now, especially now. Stephen was not blind to all of this by accident. He simply loved his wife the way good men often love the wrong things, completely and without much room left over for questioning her choices. And Amanda was skilled, genuinely skilled, at making every small exclusion feel like practicality rather than cruelty. It is a particular kind of talent, convincing an entire family that your own comfort is simply the most sensible option available. And Amanda had spent 9 years perfecting it. And now, Apparently, she had convinced herself that she did not even need to be present for the death of the woman who raised the man she married. Don't call me when she dies. Just call Stephen. I don't need to be there for that part. I lay awake long after both of them had gone, running that sentence through my mind again and again, turning it over like a stone in my palm, looking for some angle that made it hurt less. I could not find one. What I found instead, somewhere in the deep quiet hours of that night, with Mason and Ava asleep down the hall and Stephen snoring softly in the room he shares with his wife, was something I had not expected to find at all, given everything the doctors had told me. I found anger. Clean, clear, focused anger. The kind I had not allowed myself to feel in years. The kind that Harold used to say was the most useful emotion a person could have. Because unlike grief, anger gives you somewhere to put your hands. I decided that night that I was not finished. Not with living, and certainly not with this house I had watched being quietly divided up in whispers before I had even had the chance to properly say goodbye to it myself. I thought about Harold that night more than I had in months. I thought about the way he used to handle conflict. Never loudly, never with raised voices or dramatic gestures, but with a quiet, patient thoroughness that always left the other person realizing, usually too late, that they had underestimated him completely. Harold was a man who believed that the loudest person in a room rarely won anything worth winning, and that real power lay in preparation, in patience, in knowing exactly what you wanted before you ever opened your mouth to ask for it. I had spent 11 years since his death trying to carry a piece of that patience with me, and lying in that bed on that particular night, I felt him with me more clearly than I had in a very long time, as though some part of him had been waiting for exactly this moment to remind me who I actually was. Underneath all the softness, age and illness had layered over me. I also thought, that night, about my own mother, gone now for over 30 years, who used to tell me that forgiveness and weakness were not the same thing. That a woman could forgive and still protect herself. That gentleness was not the opposite of strength, but often the finest expression of it. I did not yet know, that first night, exactly what shape my response to Amanda's cruelty would take. I only knew that I was not going to simply lie in that bed and let myself become smaller because a woman half my age had decided my death was an inconvenience, to be scheduled around rather than a loss to be grieved. The next morning, when Ava climbed up onto my bed the way she always does, chattering about a science project involving baking soda and vinegar, I found myself watching her face more closely than usual, memorizing the exact shape of her smile, the small gap where her permanent tooth had not quite come in yet. And I found myself thinking, clearly, deliberately, that whatever time I had left in this world, I was going to spend some of it making very sure that Amanda Davis Carter understood exactly what kind of woman she had married into, and exactly what kind of woman she had underestimated lying in that bed. I want to be completely honest with you here, because I have decided, somewhere in these final months, that honesty is one of the very few luxuries a dying woman is still fully entitled to claim for herself without apology. What I did over the following weeks was not gentle. It was not the forgiving, saintly behavior people expect from an old woman in hospice care. The kind of behavior that makes for a tidy, comfortable story. I was angry, and I let that anger become useful, the way Harold always said it could. I am not asking you to approve of everything I did. I am only asking you to understand why I did it, and to stay with me until the end. Because there is more to this story than one cruel sentence spoken in a hallway. The first thing I did was start paying very close attention. I had spent 9 weeks in that guest room being treated like furniture with a pulse. Spoken over instead of spoken to. Discussed in front of instead of consulted. People forget that dying does not make you deaf. And it certainly did not make Betty Carter stupid. I began listening in earnest. Not eavesdropping exactly. Simply refusing to pretend I could not hear things I could. In fact, hear perfectly well. And once I started truly listening, I realized the sentence in the hallway was not an isolated cruelty. It was the tip of something much larger. Something that had been building under the surface of this house for longer than I had allowed myself to see. I learned, through pieces gathered over several days, that Amanda had already been to see a real estate agent about the house Harold and I had lived in for over 40 years. The house that still sat empty 3 streets over, waiting for me to either recover enough to return to it or to die, so it could be sold. I learned this because Amanda took a phone call in the kitchen one afternoon, believing I was asleep in the next room, and used a tone of voice reserved for people discussing profitable inconveniences. Once everything is finalized, she said into the phone, we're looking at listing it by spring. The market's good right now, and honestly, sooner is better before things get complicated. Things get complicated. That was the phrase she used to describe my death and whatever mess of feelings and family and inheritance might follow it. I lay in that guest room and I thought about Harold, about the years we spent painting the house room by room, about the maple tree we planted in the backyard the year Stephen was born, now nearly 40 feet tall, and I felt something inside me go very cold and very still. I began, in those first quiet days of careful, deliberate listening, to notice patterns I had somehow managed to overlook for years, blinded perhaps by my own desperate hope that my son's marriage was healthier than it actually was. I noticed how Amanda spoke to Stephen when she thought I was not fully paying attention. A tone of casual command dressed up as partnership, always framing her preferences as inevitabilities rather than requests. I noticed how she managed the household finances with a tight, controlling precision that left Stephen checking with her before making even small decisions. A grown man in his 40s asking permission for things Harold would never have thought twice about deciding on his own. I noticed, too, how differently she spoke to Mason and Ava depending on whether Stephen was in the room. Warmer and more patient when he was present. Sharper and more clipped when she believed herself unobserved. None of these small individual observations would have meant terribly much on their own. Taken in isolation, families are complicated, and marriages have their own private rhythms that outsiders, even mothers, rarely fully understand. But taken together, alongside the hallway conversation still echoing in my chest, they formed a portrait of a woman who had built her entire domestic life around control, around managing outcomes and appearances, with a precision that left very little room for the messy, inconvenient realities of aging, illness, and death. Realities that could not be scheduled around or managed away, no matter how skilled she was at managing everything else. I also learned, on a different afternoon, that Amanda had already spoken to a lawyer of her own, separate from the family attorney who had handled Harold's estate and mine for 23 years. I overheard this because Stephen mentioned it to her in passing, thinking he was simply confirming an appointment. And Amanda's response was quick and sharp in a way that told me this was not the first time the subject had come up between them. I told you, she said, I want my own person looking at this. Not someone who's known your mother for 2 decades and is going to tilt everything her way. Tilt everything her way. As though wanting fairness for myself, in the final chapter of my own life, was some kind of manipulation I was orchestrating from a hospital bed I could barely sit up in without help. I began to understand, piece by piece, that my daughter-in-law was not simply a woman who had grown cold toward an aging mother-in-law over the natural erosion of years. She was a woman actively managing my death as a financial event, positioning herself and, by extension, my son, to benefit from it as efficiently and as soon as possible. And the sentence she had spoken in the hallway to Rebecca Scott, "Don't call me when she dies," was not carelessness. It was scheduling. She did not want to be present for the emotional inconvenience of my death because emotional inconvenience served no purpose in the plan she had already built around it. I thought, for one long night, about simply confronting her directly, sitting up in that bed, calling her into the room, and telling her exactly what I had heard and exactly what I thought of her for it. But I am 79 years old, and I have lived long enough to know that confrontation without evidence is simply an old woman's word against a younger woman's denial. And I had watched enough of my own friends lose exactly that kind of battle in the final years of their lives, dismissed as confused, as bitter, as difficult. I decided instead to do something Harold would have been proud of. I decided to build a case. I began, quietly and without telling a single soul in that house what I was doing, to keep a careful record of everything I heard. I asked Ava, innocently enough that she suspected nothing at all, to bring me a small notebook from the drawer in the hallway, the ordinary kind meant for grocery lists and reminders, and I began carefully writing down dates and times and exact remembered words. Whenever I overheard something worth preserving for later. My handwriting has grown shaky these past months, but shaky handwriting is still legible handwriting. And I filled that notebook page by page with the architecture of my daughter-in-law's true character, laid out in her own words, spoken carelessly in front of a woman she believed could no longer understand or remember any of it. I also began, slowly and carefully, rebuilding a bridge that I had allowed to crumble quietly for far too many years, without ever quite admitting to myself how much distance had grown between its two banks. I asked Stephen, the next time he sat with me alone, whether he remembered our old family attorney, Mr. Holloway, who had drawn up Harold's will and mine so many years ago. Stephen said of course he remembered him. That Mr. Holloway used to give him butterscotch candies from a dish on his desk when he was a boy waiting for meetings to finish. I asked Stephen, as gently as I could manage, whether he would help me get in touch with him, saying only that there were some things about my affairs I wanted to update while I still had the clarity to do it properly. Stephen agreed without hesitation, and I watched something flicker across his face that told me some small part of him already suspected there was more happening in this house than he had allowed himself to see. I asked for privacy for that call, which Stephen granted without question, and I spoke to Mr. Holloway, now well into his 70s himself, but still sharp as a blade. For nearly 40 minutes. I told him everything. The hallway conversation. The real estate agent. The separate lawyer Amanda had quietly retained. The notebook I had been keeping. Mr. Holloway listened patiently without interrupting even once. The way genuinely good lawyers and genuinely good old friends both somehow know how to do. And when I finally finished laying it all out, he was quiet for a long moment before he spoke again. "Betty," he said, before I could continue, "how long have you been sitting on this alone?" I told him nearly 3 weeks, and I heard him sigh on the other end of the line. Not with judgment, but with the particular sympathy of a man who has spent decades watching families quietly fracture under exactly this kind of pressure. He told me he had seen this pattern more times than he could count in his career. Adult children, spouses positioning themselves financially around an aging parent's decline. Sometimes out of genuine greed. Sometimes out of a colder kind of practicality that convinced itself it was simply being responsible. He told me it rarely mattered, in the end, which of those it was, because the damage to the family looked the same either way. Betty, he said, I think it's time we updated your will properly. And I think it's time we did it the right way. With witnesses, with documentation, with everything airtight. So that nobody can come back later and claim you weren't of sound mind when you made your decisions. I told him that sounded exactly like what I wanted. And then I told him what I wanted the new will to say. And I heard him exhale slowly on the other end of the line. The sound of a man who has represented families for 40 years and has learned that even the gentlest-looking grandmothers can, when truly provoked, become formidable. Over the following 2 weeks, while Amanda continued speaking to real estate agents in her hushed, careful kitchen phone calls and continued consulting her separate lawyer about matters she quietly assumed I would never live long enough to notice or interfere with, I patiently rebuilt the entire architecture of my final wishes under Mr. Holloway's steady and careful guidance. He came to the house twice over those 2 weeks, introducing himself to Stephen each time simply as an old family friend stopping by to check in, which was true enough on its face that no one in the household ever thought to question it any further. He brought a colleague both times to serve as an independent witness, along with a notarized statement from my own physician confirming that I was of clear and sound mind, fully capable of understanding and directing my own affairs, dated and signed and filed away where no one could later dispute it. I left the old house to Mason and Ava together, placed carefully in a trust to be managed by Stephen until they both came fully of age, specifically and deliberately excluding Amanda from any control or legal claim over its future sale or use, with a clause explicitly written by name preventing the property from ever being listed, rented, or transferred until both grandchildren reached 25 years old. I left a portion of my savings, modest but meaningful, to Rebecca Scott, along with a letter explaining that in 9 weeks of caring for a dying woman, she had shown more genuine kindness than a family member had shown in 9 years. And that kindness like that deserved to be recognized while I was still alive to see it recognized. And I left instructions, very specific instructions, about exactly what I wanted to happen in the final days and hours of my life. Instructions that named, very deliberately, who I wanted present in that room when the moment finally came. I did not tell Stephen any of this. Not yet. I was not ready. I wanted to see, first, just how far Amanda intended to take her plan. In those 2 weeks of quiet preparation, I found myself doing something I had not expected. I found myself, in the strange, suspended time of illness, beginning to feel more like myself than I had in years. There is a particular kind of clarity that comes with knowing your days are numbered. A stripping away of the small anxieties and social hesitations that govern so much of ordinary life. I no longer worried about being polite for politeness' sake. I no longer worried about keeping the peace at the cost of my own dignity. I simply worked, quietly and methodically, on protecting the people I loved from a woman who had shown me, in one careless sentence, exactly how little she thought of me. Rebecca noticed the change in me before anyone else did. She came for her regular visit one Thursday and paused halfway through checking my blood pressure, studying my face with the particular attentiveness of someone trained to notice small shifts in her patients. You seem different this week, Mrs. Carter, she said. Sharper, somehow. I told her I had simply remembered something important about myself, and she smiled in a way that told me she understood. I was not going to elaborate further, and did not push. Over the following weeks, as our visits continued, Rebecca and I developed a kind of quiet trust that went beyond the usual boundaries of nurse and patient. She never asked directly about the tension she surely sensed building in the house, but she made herself available in small, steady ways, staying a few minutes longer some days, bringing me a crossword puzzle book one afternoon, simply because she remembered me mentioning. I used to enjoy them before my hands grew too shaky to hold a pen steadily. I found myself looking forward to her visits with an eagerness I had not expected to still be capable of feeling. I began to notice other things too, in those 2 weeks. Things about my own family that the crisis with Amanda had inadvertently brought into sharper focus. I noticed how Mason, usually reserved and private the way 14-year-old boys often are, had started lingering in my doorway after school, not always saying much. Sometimes just sitting in the chair across from my bed doing his homework in silence. As though simply wanting to be near me mattered more than any conversation we might have. I asked him once, gently, why he came to sit with me so often now, when he used to disappear straight to his room after school. He shrugged in that teenage way that pretends nonchalance, while meaning everything, and said, I don't know. Just feels important right now. I did not push him further, but I held that sentence close to my chest for days afterward, turning it over the way I had once turned over Amanda's cruelty. Except this stone was warm instead of cold. Ava, for her part, had begun bringing me small drawings nearly every day. Elaborate crayon renderings of our family, always including me prominently, always with the two of us holding hands in the corner of the page no matter what else was happening in the drawing. I kept every single one of them in the drawer of the knitstand beside my bed. A growing collection of a child's determined insistence that her grandmother mattered, that her grandmother belonged fully and visibly in the picture of this family, in stark and painful contrast to the woman down the hall who seemed to be doing everything in her power to schedule my exit from that same picture as smoothly and quietly as possible. I did not have to wait very long at all to see exactly how far Amanda intended to take her carefully arranged plan for the days that still lay ahead of us. 3 weeks after the hallway conversation, I woke early one morning to the sound of raised voices, careful but urgent, coming from the kitchen. I recognized Stephen's voice, tight with something I had rarely heard from him. A kind of controlled frustration he usually reserved for moments when he felt cornered. I recognized Amanda's voice too, defensive in the particular way people get defensive when they know they have been caught doing something they cannot fully justify. I asked Ava later that morning, casually, if she knew what her parents had been arguing about. Children notice more than adults give them credit for. And Ava, bless her honest heart, told me without hesitation that she'd heard her father say something about Grandma's house and you had no right, and her mother saying something back about being practical and somebody had think ahead. I thanked her and told her it was nothing to worry about, and I filed that information away in the notebook beside my bed. Another entry in the growing record of my daughter-in-law's careful, patient dismantling of my final wishes before I had even had the chance to voice them. I spent the rest of that day turning the conversation I had heard through Ava's account over and over in my mind, trying to decide exactly how and when to tell Stephen everything I had gathered. Part of me wanted to wait longer, to build an even more complete picture before revealing my hand. Sigh. Harold always advised waiting until you held every card before showing any of them. But another part of me, the part that had spent 3 weeks lying awake feeling the full weight of what I had overheard in that hallway, felt that I had already waited long enough, that every additional day of silence was another day my son spent unknowingly married to a plan that treated his own mother's Death as a logistical inconvenience. To be managed around. That evening, Stephen came to sit with me alone. Something he had been doing less and less of in recent weeks. Always drawn away by some errand or obligation Amanda had assigned him. He looked tired in a way that went beyond simple exhaustion. He looked like a man beginning to see something he had spent years refusing to look at directly. "Mom," he said, sitting on the edge of my bed the way he used to when he was a boy homesick from school. "Can I ask you something?" I told him he could ask me anything, and I meant it. Because I had decided that whatever came next in this story needed to be built on honesty. Me included. "Did you know Amanda's been talking to a real estate agent about your house?" I told him I did know, and I watched his face crumble slightly. The particular crumble of a man realizing his mother has been carrying a burden alone that he should have noticed sooner. I told him everything then. Not with anger, though I still felt plenty of it simmering beneath the surface. But with the calm, deliberate honesty of a woman who has had 3 weeks to plan exactly how this conversation needed to unfold. I told him about the hallway. "Don't call me when she dies." I told him about the phone calls. I told him about the separate lawyer. I showed him the notebook, page after page of dates and quotes. And I watched my grown son read through the record of his wife's true character in his mother's shaking handwriting, his jaw tightening with every page. When he finished, he sat in silence for a long moment, staring down at his own hands the way Harold used to when he was working through something difficult. And then he said the words I had been hoping, quietly, desperately, that he still had it in him to say. "I need to talk to her, tonight." I did not ask to be present for that conversation. Some things a mother should not witness, even a mother as determined as I had become. But I heard pieces of it drift down the hallway that night. Stephen's voice steadier and firmer than I had heard it in years. Amanda's voice rising and falling between defensiveness and something that, toward the end, began to sound almost like fear. The particular fear of someone realizing the ground beneath them is no longer as solid as they had assumed. I heard Stephen's voice rise at one point, more sharply than I had ever heard him speak to her in 9 years of marriage, saying something about how she had gone behind both their backs, how she had treated his dying mother's property like an asset to be liquidated before the body was even cold. A phrase that made me flinch even through the wall separating us, though I could not decide if the flinch came from pain or from a strange, unexpected satisfaction at finally hearing my son say aloud what I had been feeling in silence for weeks. I heard Amanda's voice crack at one point, not quite crying but close to it, insisting that she had only been trying to plan responsibly for the future, that someone in the marriage had to think practically, that she resented always being cast as the villain simply for being the one willing to face hard realities the rest of the family preferred to avoid. Mason came to my door at one point during the argument, standing there in his pajamas looking uncertain, and I told him quietly to come sit with me for a while, that his parents were working through something and it would be better for both of us to stay out of it. He climbed up onto the edge of my bed the way he had not done in over a year. Too old now for the easy physical affection of his childhood, but apparently not too old to need it on a night like this. We sat together in silence, listening to the muffled rise and fall of voices down the hall, and I found myself thinking that whatever else came from this whole painful situation, at least it had brought my grandson back to my bedside for one more quiet evening together. I want to tell you that this is where the story softens, where Amanda breaks down in tears and apologizes and everything resolves, the way it does in the stories with tidy endings. But I promised you honesty, and honesty requires me to tell you what actually happened. Because life very rarely hands us the clean resolution we are hoping for. Amanda did not apologize that night. Instead, 3 days later, while I was resting after a particularly difficult morning, she came into my room alone for the first time in weeks. Closing the door quietly behind her, she sat down in the chair beside my bed, the same chair Rebecca usually sat in, and she looked at me for a long moment before she spoke. "You told him," she said, not quite a question. I told her yes, I had told him everything and I was not sorry for it. "You were never supposed to hear that," she said. And there was something almost pleading in her voice now, though I could not yet tell if it was genuine regret or simply the panic of a woman realizing her carefully built plan was collapsing. It came out wrong. I didn't mean it the way it sounded. I asked her, as calmly as I could manage, exactly how a sentence like, "Don't call me when she dies," could possibly be meant any other way than it sounded. She did not have an answer for that. She sat there in the chair, twisting her hands together, and for the first time in 9 years, I saw something in her face that looked less like careful performance and more like an actual human being confronting the size of what she had done. Whether that moment was real, whether it changed anything lasting in her, I genuinely cannot tell you. And I have decided I am no longer interested in spending what remains of my strength trying to guess at the true contents of Amanda Carter's heart. I have spent too many years already trying to read kindness into a woman who, it turns out, was simply very good at performing it when performing it served her. She stayed in that chair a while longer, and in the silence that followed, she told me things I had not expected to hear. Things about her own upbringing, about a mother who had struggled financially for most of Amanda's childhood, about the fear of instability that had followed her into adulthood like a shadow she could never quite outrun. She told me that watching me lie in that bed, dying slowly, surrounded by a family that clearly loved me despite everything, had stirred something in her she did not know how to name. A mixture of guilt and a strange, uncomfortable envy of a kind of security she had never allowed herself to feel even in her own marriage. I listened to all of this without softening, without rushing to reassure her, because I had learned enough in 79 years to know that understanding where someone's cruelty comes from does not erase the cruelty itself, even if it does sometimes explain it. "That doesn't excuse what you said," I told her, when she finally finished. "A hard childhood explains a lot of things, Amanda, but it doesn't excuse planning around a woman's death like she's a line item on a spreadsheet." She nodded slowly, and for the first time since I had known her, she did not immediately try to defend herself further. She simply sat with the discomfort of being seen clearly, perhaps for the first time in years, and I let the silence between us stretch out long enough that she had no choice but to sit inside it. What I can tell you is what happened after. Stephen, to his credit, did not simply forgive and forget the way he might have in years past. He insisted on transparency going forward. He cancelled the meeting Amanda had scheduled with the real estate agent regarding my house before it ever took place. He asked Amanda to end things with the separate lawyer she had retained, and whether out of genuine remorse or simple recognition that the game was up, she'd. Whether this fixed their marriage in any lasting way is not a story I can tell you, because it is not my story to tell, and because I am, above everything else, still someone's mother, and I have decided not to spend my final months tearing apart my son's family for the sake of my own satisfaction, however satisfying it might have felt in the moment. I noticed, in the days that followed, small changes in the rhythm of the house that told me something real had shifted, even if I could not fully measure how deep that shift ran. Amanda stopped taking phone calls in the kitchen with the door half closed. She began asking Stephen directly about decisions, rather than making them alone and presenting them afterward as settled fact. She started, tentatively at first and then with slightly more ease, spending time in my room without an obvious agenda, sometimes simply sitting quietly while I napped, other times attempting conversation that felt stiff and unpracticed but genuine in its effort. I will admit that some part of me remained guarded during those weeks, unwilling to fully trust a change that had come only after being caught rather than one that had come freely from some deeper reconsideration on her part. I have lived long enough to know that people are capable of real change, but I have also lived long enough to know that fear of consequence and genuine transformation can look remarkably similar in their early stages, and only time reveals which one you are actually looking at. I decided, in the end, that it was not my job to determine which one Amanda was experiencing. It was only my job to protect what needed protecting, and to leave the rest to whatever time she and Stephen had left together to work out on their own. What I did instead was something quieter and in its own way, something far more powerful than confrontation ever could have been. I asked Stephen to gather the whole family together, all of them, including Rebecca if she was willing to come on her own time. On a Sunday afternoon 3 weeks after that conversation in my room, I told him I wanted to talk about the will, formally, in front of everyone, so there would be no confusion later and no room for anyone to claim I had been anything other than fully aware of my own decisions. They gathered in the living room on a bright Sunday afternoon, Stephen and Amanda side by side on the couch, an arm's length of careful distance between them that had not existed 9 years earlier, Mason and Ava on the floor by my wheelchair, and Rebecca standing quietly near the doorway, having come on her day off simply because I had asked her to, and because in 9 weeks she had become, in every way that mattered, more family to me than the woman sitting on that couch. I told them, in a voice steadier than I had managed in weeks, exactly what I had decided, and why. I told them about the house, and the trust for Mason and Ava, and the specific clause preventing its sale until they came of age. I watched Amanda's face carefully as I said this, and I saw, for just a moment, the flicker of something like anger cross it before she smoothed it back into something more acceptable, told about a gift. I had left her and the letter explaining why, and I watched Rebecca's eyes fill with tears she quickly wiped away with the back of her hand, embarrassed by her own emotion. I told them, too, about the maple tree in the backyard of the old house, the one Harold and I planted the week Stephen was born, and how I had added a specific instruction to the trust that the tree could never be removed for as long as the property remained in the family, a small, sentimental clause that Mr. Halloway had gently teased me about while drafting it, though he included it exactly as I asked without further argument. I explained to Mason and Ava, watching their faces carefully, that the tree was older than their father, that it had grown alongside him through every stage of his life, and that I hoped one day, long after I was gone, they might sit beneath its shade with their own children and tell them the story of the grandmother, who made very sure that tree would still be standing for them to do exactly that. Stephen's eyes were wet by the time I finished speaking, and he did not try to hide it, which surprised me a little, given how carefully men of his generation are taught to guard against exactly that kind of visible emotion in front of others. He simply let the tears come, sitting there on the couch beside his wife, and I understood in that moment that, whatever else had gone wrong in this house over the past 9 years, my son's love for me had never once wavered, even during the years when distance and Amanda's quiet influence had made it harder for him to show it as often as he should have. And then I told them the last thing, the thing I had decided mattered most of all. I told them I forgave Amanda. I want you to understand that this was not weakness. This was not an old woman too tired to keep fighting, too frightened of death to spend her remaining energy on anger. I forgave her because I had watched, in the weeks since that hallway conversation, what genuine consequence actually looks like when it lands on someone. I had watched her lose the quiet control she had spent 9 years building. I had watched her son and husband begin to see her clearly for the first time. I had watched her sit in that chair beside my bed and, whether out of guilt or fear or something closer to real remorse, admit that what she had said was wrong. I decided that carrying hatred into whatever time I had left was a burden I was no longer willing to shoulder. Not because Amanda deserved my forgiveness, but because I deserved my own peace. I told her, in front of everyone, that I hoped she would use whatever time she had left with Stephen and the children more wisely than she had used the last 9 years, and that I was choosing, deliberately and with my eyes open, to release the anger I had been carrying since that afternoon in the hallway. I told her this was not because I had forgotten what she said, but because I refused to let what she said become the last thing I gave power to in this life. Amanda cried, actually cried. Real tears rather than performed ones. For the first time since I had known her. Whether that moment changed her permanently, I cannot promise you. People are complicated, and 9 years of careful self-interest do not simply dissolve in a single Sunday afternoon confession. But something shifted in that room. Something I could feel even through the fog of my medication. And I decided that was enough. It was enough to have said what needed saying, to have protected what needed protecting, and to have chosen, in the end, grace over bitterness, even toward a woman who had shown me so very little of it herself. Mason, sitting on the floor beside my wheelchair, reached up and took my hand at that moment without a word. The same gesture he used to make as a small boy crossing a busy parking lot. Instinctive and protective all at once. Ava climbed halfway into my lap despite the wheelchair's awkward angles, careless of the tubes and monitors, simply wanting to be as close to me as physically possible. Stephen stood behind the couch with his hand resting on his wife's shoulder. Not quite an embrace, but not quite distance either. A small, uncertain gesture toward whatever repair might still be possible between them. And Rebecca, still standing near the doorway, wiped her eyes discreetly and gave me a small nod. The kind of nod that told me she understood exactly what that moment had cost me. And exactly what it meant. That I had chosen to spend it on forgiveness, rather than on the anger I had every right to keep holding. After everyone else had gone that evening, after the dishes were cleared and the children put to bed and the house had settled into its familiar nighttime quiet, Stephen came back to sit with me one more time. He did not say much. He simply held my hand for a long while. The way he used to when he was very small and afraid of thunderstorms. And eventually he said, "I should have seen it sooner, Mom, all of it. Not just Amanda. The way things had gotten between us these past few years." I told him that sons rarely see clearly what is happening to their mothers until something forces them to look directly at it, and that I did not blame him for needing this particular storm to finally see clearly. I told him that what mattered now was not the years we had lost to distance and misunderstanding, but the months we still had left, however many or few they turned out to be, and how we chose to spend them. He nodded and kissed my forehead the way he had not done since he was a much younger man, and told me he loved me before he left the room. And I lay awake a long while after he'd gone, feeling something in my chest that had been missing for a very long time finally settle back into its proper place. In the weeks since that Sunday, Things in this house have changed in small but real ways. Amanda comes to sit with me now, not every day. And not always with much to say, but she comes. And she stays longer than she used to. And last Tuesday she brought me a cup of tea without being asked, setting it on the table beside my bed, with a quiet awkwardness that told me she still did not quite know how to be the kind of person this moment required, but that she was, at least, trying. Stephen visits every single day now, sometimes with the children, sometimes alone, and Sundays have become what they used to be again. A day that belongs to family in the fullest sense of that word. Rebecca still comes 3 times a week, and I have come to think of her not as my nurse but simply as a friend who happens to also check my blood pressure, and I am deeply, quietly grateful that whatever time remains for me will include her steady presence in it. There was a moment last week that I have not been able to stop thinking about since it happened. Amanda came into my room in the late afternoon, the light slanting gold through the window the way it does in early autumn, and she sat down in the chair beside my bed without her phone in her hand for once. Without any obvious agenda pulling her attention elsewhere. She asked me, hesitantly, if I would tell her about Harold. About what he was like as a young man, about how we met. I had not expected the question, and for a moment I simply looked at her, trying to decide if this was another performance, or something closer to real curiosity. I decided, in the end, that it did not matter which it was. That the asking itself was worth honoring, and so I told her. I told her about the dance hall where Harold and I met when I was 22. About the terrible joke he told me that made me laugh despite myself. About the 11 years since his death that had felt some days like walking around with half my own body missing. Amanda listened the entire time without interrupting, and when I finished, she was quiet for a long moment before she said, softly, that she wished she had asked me these things years ago. That she wished she had made the effort to actually know me instead of simply tolerating my presence at family gatherings. I did not tell her that it was too late for that regret to matter much anymore. I simply told her that it was not too late to know me now. That I still had stories left to tell if she was willing to listen to them. And something in her face shifted at that. A kind of relief mixed with something that looked almost like hope. The hope of someone who has been given a second chance she did not entirely believe she deserved. I think often, in these quiet weeks, about what it means to truly change, versus what it means to simply behave better while consequences are still fresh and watching closely. I do not know yet which one I am witnessing in Amanda. Perhaps I never will know for certain, not in the time I have left. But I have decided that watching for the effort itself, the daily small choices toward kindness rather than convenience, matters more than demanding proof of some permanent internal transformation I have no real way of verifying. People show you who they are becoming through their actions over time, not through any single confession, however tearful. And I intend to spend whatever days remain to me paying close attention to those actions. The way I once paid close attention to the words she thought I could not hear. I do not know how many more Sundays I have left. The doctors are still using words like months rather than years. And I have made a kind of peace with that uncertainty that I did not think I would ever be capable of making. But I know that the sentence which once felt like a wound, "Don't call me when she dies," has become something else entirely by the time I am telling you this story. It has become the moment that woke me up. Not to my own dying, but to my own remaining life. To the fact that even in a hospice bed, even with months instead of years, a woman still has the power to protect what matters to her. To speak the truth even when it is uncomfortable, and to choose, in the end, what kind of legacy she leaves behind, not just in a will, but in the way she handles the people who have wronged her. Rebecca came by yesterday, on what was supposed to be one of her days off. Simply to check in, she said. Though I suspect there was more to the visit than routine concern. We sat together for nearly an hour, longer than any of her official appointments have ever run, talking about everything and nothing, the way old friends do when the clock stops mattering as much as the company. She told me, near the end of the visit, that in all her years doing hospice work, she had rarely seen a family reshape itself so visibly in such a short span of time, and that she considered it a privilege to have witnessed even a small part of what unfolded in this house. I told her that privilege belonged equally to me. That having someone like her in these final months, someone who saw me clearly and treated me with genuine respect from the very first day, had made an enormous difference in how I was able to face everything that followed. I think about the notebook sometimes, still sitting in the drawer of my knitstand, filled with those careful, shaky entries documenting weeks I never expected to have to document. I have not thrown it away, though I no longer need it the way I once did. I keep it, I think, as a reminder to myself of exactly how much strength a woman can find even when everyone around her assumes she has none left. Exactly how much clarity remains available to us even in our most vulnerable hours, if only we are willing to reach for it instead of simply accepting the smaller, quieter version of ourselves that illness and age try to convince us we have become. Mason asked me last week, sitting in his usual chair with his homework forgotten in his lap, whether I was scared. I told him the truth, because I have decided the truth is the only thing worth giving the people I love in whatever time remains. I told him yes, some days I am scared. In the quiet hours before dawn when the house is silent and my body reminds me exactly how little of it still works the way it used to. But I told him I am not scared in the way I once thought I would be. Not scared of being forgotten. Not scared of leaving nothing behind that mattered. Because I have spent these past months making very sure that will not be true. I told him that scared and at peace can live in the same chest at the same time. That one does not have to defeat the other for a person to still call her life, even its final chapter, a good one. He did not say much back. He simply reached over and squeezed my hand the way he had learned to do this year. And we sat together in comfortable silence while the afternoon light moved slowly across the wall, and I thought, not for the first time these past few months, that whatever time I have left, however it ends and whenever it comes, I have already been given more than I once feared I would get. I have been given the chance to be truly seen again. By my son, by my grandchildren, even, in some new and uncertain way, by the daughter-in-law, who once thought so little of my final days that she asked not to be called for them. I sat with Ava this morning while she practiced her spelling words at the small desk they moved into the corner of my room a few weeks ago, so she could do her homework near me instead of alone in her bedroom down the hall. She looked up at one point, pencil hovering over her paper, and asked me, with the blunt honesty only an 11-year-old can manage, whether I would still be here for her next birthday. I told her I did not know for certain. That none of us ever really know how many birthdays we get to share with the people we love. But that whether or not I was still here in body, she should know that every single thing she has drawn for me, every hug at the door, every afternoon spent doing homework beside my bed, had already become a permanent part of who I am, carried forward in her no matter what happens next. She thought about that for a long moment. The particular serious thinking of a child, working through something bigger than her years. And then she went back to her spelling words. And a few minutes later she started humming quietly to herself. And I decided that was answer enough. That children process these enormous truths in their own time and their own way. And that my job was simply to keep giving her honest, gentle answers whenever she was ready to ask. I think, in the end, this is what I most want you to carry away from this whole long story of mine. More than the sharp anger I felt lying in that hallway shadow, More even than the quiet satisfaction of watching real consequences finally land exactly where they belonged after so many years of going unnoticed. I want you to understand that even in the hardest chapters of our lives, even when the people closest to us disappoint us in ways that cut deeper than we thought possible, we still retain the power to choose how we respond, what we protect, and what kind of legacy we leave in our wake. I could have spent these final months bitter, and no one would have blamed me for it. I could have let that one sentence in the hallway define everything that followed. Instead, I chose to let it wake me up. To remind of exactly who Betty Carter has always been underneath the softness and the politeness, and the years of quietly shrinking myself to keep the peace. And I have found, somewhat to my own surprise, that the woman underneath is not done yet, not by a long shot. Regardless of what the doctor's calendars might suggest, I am still here. I am still Betty Carter. And whatever time I have left, I intend to spend it awake, in every sense of that word. For whoever is willing to sit beside me and listen. Thank you for staying with me through this whole story tonight. If you made it this far, I want to know where you're watching from. So go ahead and tell me your name and your city down in the comments below. I truly do read every single one. And it warms this old heart more than you know too. Hear from all of you scattered across the world. If this story moved you even a little, if you have a grandmother of your own who you love, whoever held your hand or made you feel safe just by being in the room, do an old woman a favor and hit that like button for her right now. Subscribe if you haven't already, because I have many more stories still left to tell. And share this with a friend who still calls their grandma just to hear her voice, because that phone call means more than they will ever know. Until next time, take care of the people who took care of you.